The high-stakes midterm season is kicking into full gear, but this time it's not just control of the House and the Senate on the line. If you listen to what President Biden said in Philadelphia Thursday, the choice on the ballot will help determine the fate of American democracy. Let's listen.
Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic. MAGA Republicans do not respect the Constitution. They do not believe in the rule of law. They do not recognize the will of the people. They refuse to accept the results of a free election.
And last night, former President Trump responded saying this about the man who defeated him in 2020.
He's an enemy of the state. You want to know the truth? The enemy of the state is him and the group that control him, which is circling around him. Do this, do that, Joe. You're going to do this, Joe, right?
And joining me now to talk about this is CNN senior political analyst and senior editor for The Atlantic, Ron Brownstein, and Barbara Walter, professor of international relations at the University of California, San Diego. She's also the author of the book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. Ron, I do think we have to hit the pause button and talk about what Trump said last night. Those remarks calling, here you have the former president of the United States calling the current president of the United States an enemy of the state. Did Donald Trump just prove Joe Biden's point?
Look, I mean, I think the evidence is overwhelming that Donald Trump is the leader of an undemocratic faction in American politics that is now the dominant faction in the Republican Party. It's not the entire Republican Party, and President Biden was very clear and explicit in making that case during his speech last week. But it is the dominant faction. When you look at the results of the primaries this summer, Trump-style election deniers are winning in state after state. And Jim, what I have found to be extremely revealing is the reaction from so many other Republican elected officials and conservative pundits to the speech, because as you know, they are all saying, in effect, that Biden smeared all of you. He said that anybody who doesn't support Democrats is a threat to American democracy. In fact, he said the opposite. But I think the reason why they want to put that message out is they don't want the 1/5 to 1/4 of Republicans that polls consistently tell us are uneasy with Trump and Trumpism to believe that they have another choice but falling in line in a party where they are now clearly the subordinate minority.
Right. And Barbara, you study civil wars. Is President Biden right about the threat the country faces right now, do you think?
He is partly, although I want to emphasize we're not on the precipice of civil war. But we know from just decades of research on civil wars that partial democracies, so weak and declining democracies, and those democracies with political parties that have broken down along racial and religious lines are at the highest risk of political violence and civil war. And we have, again, as we just heard, we have a big faction of one of our two major parties who wants to unravel our democracy because it no longer serves them. They can't win if we remain a one-person, one-vote democracy. And so that's the direction they'd want to move us into, which is that dangerous zone. And then, of course, we do have political parties that have definitely broken down along racial and religious lines. So as long as we continue to have these two features in our country, we're going to continue to be at increasing risk of violence in the future.
And Ron, I want to play another moment from Trump's speech last night when he went after the FBI and the Justice Department for the search at Mar-a-Lago. Again, another incendiary, dangerous, irresponsible comment from Trump. Here's what he had to say.
The FBI and the Justice Department have become vicious monsters controlled by radical left scoundrels, lawyers, and the media who tell them what to do, you people right there, and when to do it. They're trying to silence me, and more importantly, they are trying to silence you, but we will not be silenced, right?
Now, in response to that, Congresswoman Liz Cheney tweeted this, and we can show this. Trump is attacking law enforcement and yet again using language he knows will provoke violence. Only one group of Americans has a chance to diminish this danger: Republicans. If my fellow Republicans fail to step up to stop this, they will share the blame for all that follows. Ron, I mean, you know, Barbara is right in that we're not on the edge of falling into a civil war, going into a civil war where people are killing each other in the streets. But this kind of language can incite violence. And isn't that the point here?
Yeah, look, I've written that we are, I believe, in the modern equivalent of the 1850s. The only question is what the modern equivalent of the 1860s looks like. And by that, I mean that we are functionally already in a Cold War between two inimical factions that have fundamentally different visions for what the country should be. And Liz Cheney is right fundamentally. I think when people who study this internationally will say that the key when, and I will defer to Professor Walter on this, but the key when democracies are threatened by undemocratic forces, the key is what does the center right do? Do they try to isolate those undemocratic forces, or do they try to benefit from them, benefit from their energy in the belief, often mistaken, that they can control it and harness it? And certainly Republicans throughout the Trump presidency, and as we are seeing again after his presidency with the reaction to the Mar-a-Lago search warrant, they have chosen the former strategy. They are trying to get the benefits of how Trump energizes his movement without confronting the full-scale reality of the level of threat that he poses to democracy as we have known it in this country. You know, the paradox, Jim, is that while there are undeniable electoral benefits to the energy Trump has unleashed, there's also a real cost. And there is the potential that a normal midterm election, which would have been a referendum on the party in power that probably would not have gone very well for Democrats, is clearly evolving into something much more of a choice where they have much more of a fighting chance. And part of that is the Supreme Court on abortion, but part of it also is voters asking, are they comfortable with the reemergence of Trump to the extent that we have seen?
Right. Republicans want the midterms to be about Joe Biden, and Donald Trump is making it about himself right now. And Barbara, you write not only about civil wars, but how to prevent them. It's right in the title of your book. What do you think about this? Is it helpful in terms of easing the divide for President Biden to call out the threat? Is it helpful in terms of preventing damage being done to our democracy by calling out and having a discussion like we are having right now, playing what Trump was saying last night and having this discussion?
Yeah, I think it's a really fine line where you don't want to be unusually or unreasonably alarmist. You don't want to create a sense of fear in the population so that they become uneasy and they feel threatened. That is, in fact, what Donald Trump is trying to do. He is engaging in fear mongering as a way to gain support, which is a very dangerous strategy in the long term. The Democrats have to be very careful, and I think Biden has been quite careful. It's 2 years into his presidency. We know that America's democracy has been declining since 2016, and this is the first time he's really come out publicly and stated it very clearly. And the reason he's doing that is he doesn't want people to become afraid. But the reality is, if you don't say anything, if you stick your head in the ground, this actually makes it easier for those who do want to create some sort of authoritarian or strong man minority rule government here, sort of similar to what you have in Hungary. It simply allows them to do that more easily. They could do it quietly behind the scenes, and no one's looking. And what Biden did was really, he lifted the curtain on that.
All right, Ron Brownstein, Barbara Walter, we'll have this discussion. We'll continue to have it. Thanks so much for being on with us this evening. We appreciate it.